In the vast Wyoming prairie where the cold wind can swallow human voices, a lone man opens a door and sees what will change his life. A strange woman, a bruised face, a trembling letter that warns of danger, and the eyes of someone who was once chased to the horizon. If it were you in the middle of a harsh land facing a stranger carrying such great darkness, what would you do? Reach out to save or close your heart to protect yourself? Perhaps each of us, at some point in our lives, has faced such a choice that makes our hearts waver. Jonas Hale chose not to turn away, but that also meant embarking on a challenging journey where goodness meets darkness. And the question for you is, when fate places a weak person at your door, does your heart have the courage to open the door? If you want to know what happened behind that door, like, share, and subscribe to join this emotional story. The afternoon wind from the Bighorn Mountains blew across the dry grasslands, carrying the scent of Wyoming's red earth and the lingering chill of winter. The setting sun painted the sky a pale orange and a deep purple. In the land where only the wind answered the wind for hundreds of miles, everything was slow, quiet, and as unpredictable as the fate of the people who lived there. Jonas Hale leaned against the wooden fence on the east side of the ranch, his ashen eyes staring out at the trail that stretched to the horizon. At 47, he had the build of a typical Western rancher, tall, broad-shouldered skin tanned by the sun and wind, hands calloused from a lifetime of handling rope and mending fences. An old flannel shirt, faded jeans, leather boots, nearly 10 years old. His hair was black with a few streaks of gray, and his face had hard features, but a gentleness hidden behind them. He let out a sigh, the breath dissolving into the wind like a forgotten story. He'd been sleeping less these days. Not because of work, his small ranch had only 40 or so cows and 3 horses, all of which required regular daily care. But because the emptiness was more acute than usual. They always said the West was so vast it swallowed even a man's sigh. Perhaps it was true, but there were some pains, no matter how vast, that couldn't be escaped. Jonas returned to the cabin as the sun sank behind the hills. The wooden door creaked softly, a sound so familiar that it made him pause. It had been 10 years since his late wife had died from complications during childbirth. The baby had not lived, and his wife had passed away in his arms before she could say the child's name. Since then, the cabin, less than 800 square feet in size, had been a place filled only with the sound of his footsteps and the crack of wood on the floor. Inside the cabin, the dim light of an oil lamp illuminated the pine walls. On the dining table lay a pile of unopened mail, mostly bills and letters from the town. Jonas was not highly educated, but he knew that looking at the monotonous print only made his heart heavier. One envelope, however, lay off the pile. The paper was pale yellow and the handwriting delicate, as if the writer had considered every word. Jonas had stared at it for days without opening it. But tonight he felt a strange urge. He sat down, pulled a wooden chair up to the table, and opened the envelope. It was so quiet in the cabin he could hear the rustle of paper. From Western Matrimony Agency, Jonas muttered, his eyebrows furrowed. He remembered 3 months ago, on a cold winter night, after 2 days of burying himself in work, just to not think he had sent in his mail-order bride application. At the time, he didn't really believe it. It was just... something urged him to do something foolish, but very human: find someone to talk to share meals with, to call each other in the morning. Jonas had thought he would never get a reply. The farm was remote, he was not an interesting man, and he did not write well. He wrote simply, "My name is Jonas Hale. I live in Willow Ridge. I can't promise much except safety and kindness." Now the handwriting in the reply made his chest tighten. "Mr. Hale, we are pleased to inform you that a woman named Miriam Clark has agreed to come to Wyoming in response to your letter of request. She will arrive at Willow Ridge on April 21. We hope this union will bring peace to both of you." Jonas put the letter down on the table. A wave of mixed emotions rushed through him: confusion, fear, hope, and guilt toward his dead wife. He stood up and walked to the stove as if seeking warmth to dispel something. The flickering flames reflected in his dark eyes. "What the hell am I doing?" he muttered. He was a strong man in the face of blizzards, of raging cattle, of wolves prowling the farm. But when faced with the changes in his own life, he felt like a child, lacking courage. Jonas wonders, am I good enough to welcome a woman into my life? Will she be disappointed when she sees me a lonely rancher with nothing but calloused hands and an old wooden roof? Will my past scare her? These questions swirled in his mind. All evening, Jonas paced the wooden floor, his footsteps rhythmically echoing his anxiety. Finally, he stopped at the window. Outside was a dark night, the stars scattered across the sky like white salt falling on water. "I'm not sure I'm ready," Jonas said to the void. "But maybe. I don't want to be alone forever." He put the letter in a desk drawer more carefully than he had put away his land deeds. Then he stepped out onto the porch, pulled his coat back on, and leaned against a wooden post, looking toward the trail that led into town. The trail, only 12 miles long, felt to him like a border between his old life and something that was waiting. In the chilly early night air, Jonas stood there for a long time, not waiting for anyone, but waiting for himself to find the answer. Finally, he let out a long breath and nodded slightly, as if making the most important decision since his wife's death. 3 more days, he whispered. "If she comes, I will try, no matter how scared I am." And somewhere inside him, Jonas felt a small light, like a match struck on a windy night. Not bright enough to light his way, but enough to let him know that he was still alive, that the heart that seemed to have turned to stone had never really gone out. 3 days from now, a woman fleeing the storms of life will arrive here, and Jonas Hale doesn't know if he has the courage to open the door for her, or not. The morning of April 21 came with a thin layer of fog covering the valley of Willow Ridge. The low hills to the east were still chilly, while the sun was trying to break through the clouds to dye the grass that stretched for miles golden. The air smelled of earth, horse manure, and pine burning from the cabins scattered around town. It was a morning like any other in the West, but for Jonas Hale it was different. He woke earlier than usual without the crowing of a rooster or the lowing of a cow. He slept fitfully through the night. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the letter from the Western Matrimony Agency appeared in a faint streak of light. Sometimes he saw himself standing in the middle of the farmyard holding a clumsy bouquet of wildflowers. Sometimes he saw a woman turning away at the sight of him, leaving him standing in the wind like a fool. Other times he found himself cleaning the cabin late into the night, worrying that everything wasn't clean or presentable enough for a special guest. "A guest," Jonas muttered as he pulled on his boots. "She's not a guest." Even so, he still felt nervous, like a young man about to meet someone for the first time. Perhaps because it had been so long, he no longer remembered what it felt like to wait for someone to come to him. He pulled out his best flannel shirt and his old dust-free cowboy hat. He led his brown horse Oakley out of the stall and stroked its mane. Oakley snorted as if he knew this was a strange day. "Come on, don't look at me like that," Jonas said softly. "We're both worried." The road to town was 12 miles. Jonas urged his horse slowly to allow his mind to settle. But as he approached Willow Ridge, his heart pounded like a drum. The close-packed log cabins, the dusty old signs of the West, all felt familiar and yet foreign. Many people he knew stopped to say hello, and a few curiously stared at him longer than usual. Jonas Hale, dressed better than usual, a blacksmith called from the shop. He must be expecting someone. Jonas just bowed, trying to keep his composure despite his burning ears. When he reached the stagecoach office, he tied Oakley to a wooden post and stood under the awning. The smell of dry pine mixed with the dirt smell of the dirt road reminded him of the mail wagons he had received. But today it was not mail. Today it was people. Franklin Rowe, the stagecoach operator, saw Jonas and smiled. "I hear you're expecting someone special." Jonas did not look upset, but he did not confirm it either. He just said, "I am not sure what will happen, but I came to get her." Franklin nodded, his eyes filled with emotion. In the West, people understood the value of starting over after a loss. Everyone had a past, it was just how we carried it that made us different. The sound of steel wheels hitting the ground shook the town slightly. A large cloud of dust rose from the path. The red stagecoach was coming from the east, pulled by 4 strong horses. Jonas gripped the edge of the porch lightly, his chest swelling as if ready to explode. The car stopped in front of the station. Dust was flying. Jonas stood up straight, looking calm but trembling. The car door opened. A pair of small brown shoes stepped down first, then the edge of a long silver-blue dress. Finally, a woman appeared out of the dust. The figure was small, but something about it made Jonas choke. Miriam Clark. She wore an old, wide-brimmed hat and a gray woolen shawl. Her face, though mostly hidden by the brim, showed a hint of weariness. But what Jonas noticed most was a purple bruise that ran from her cheekbone to under her eye, faint at the edges but still painfully obvious. She looked around, clearly worried, as if afraid someone would step out of the crowd and drag her away. Jonas moved closer, breathing slowly so as not to frighten her. "Miss Clark?" he asked, his voice low but soft. Miriam turned back, her blue eyes trembling slightly. Then, very slowly, she nodded. "Yes. I am Miriam Clark." Her voice was hoarse, as if she had been crying for days. Jonas took off his hat and bowed slightly. "I am Jonas Hale. I have come to pick you up." At that moment Miriam handed him a small folded note, the paper wrinkled and damp as if it had been held in his hand for a long time. "You should read this first," she said. "Then, if you change your mind, I won't blame you." Jonas opened the paper. "Mr. Hale, this woman is not just looking for marriage, she is looking for safety. She has been through something no one should have to go through. If you do not want to take this on, we will refund the entire fee. She needs kindness more than anything." Jonas put the note down, his heart aching. He looked at Miriam. Not at the bruise, but at the fragile yet stubborn fear in her eyes, the eyes of someone who had run far, but still didn't know if she would be accepted. Miriam spoke softly, as if wanting to retreat to avoid being disturbed. "I understand if you don't want to get into trouble. I'm nobody. I just need a place to breathe for a few more days." Jonas took a step forward, his voice firm but soft. "Miss Clark, I don't know what you've been through, but I know this." He stopped and took a deep breath. "You're not alone now." Miriam clutched the canvas bag, her lip quivering, but no tears came. There was only a very small, very weak nod, but enough for Jonas to see that the words had come at the right time. He turned to help her lift the small wooden suitcase from the driver's hands. It was so light that Jonas guessed she carried nothing but a few fragments of memories she wanted to put away. "Are you ready to leave town?" Jonas asked. Miriam looked around. Some of the villagers looked at her curiously, some whispered, some stared at the bruise a little too long. She replied softly, almost in a whisper, "I don't want to stay here long." Jonas nodded. "Then let's go." He helped her onto Oakley. She trembled slightly when Jonas put his hand on her elbow to steady her, but she did not flinch. As she mounted her horse, Miriam looked far out toward the ranch, where the wind was strong, but there were few people, few gossips, few dangers, a place she had never known but hoped for. Jonas climbed up behind her, keeping enough distance so she wouldn't feel pressured, but still knew he was there. And as Oakley begins to walk, two seemingly unrelated people begin a journey neither of them expected. A lonely rancher, a woman with bruises and warning notes, and one small sentence, but enough to change fate. "You're not alone now." As Oakley made his way slowly across the Wyoming wasteland, the evening wind blew through Miriam's hair, sweeping the dust from the brim of his cap. Beside her, Jonas kept his back straight, but not tense. He kept a distance far enough to make Miriam feel safe, but close enough that if she slipped, he could catch her. The valley opened before them, a vast reddish-brown scarf stretching to the horizon. Clumps of sagebrush swayed in the wind. A few deer stood in the distance, looking up as if watching the two people as they entered into their story. Miriam kept her hands around the saddle, her head bowed to keep the wind out of her face. But Jonas watched as she kept adjusting her shawl to partially conceal the bruise on her cheek. Her hands were thin and trembling, as if she were always tense with fear. Jonas didn't ask, not because he wasn't curious, but because he understood that the more you pressed people about some things, the more they closed in on themselves. After nearly an hour of riding, Jonas's log cabin appeared on the slope of a low hill. Not large, not beautiful, but standing proud in the wind, like a man accustomed to suffering. The eaves sagged slightly to one side. Smoke from the chimney drew a thin column up into the sky. Beside the cabin was an old stable, and not far away was a corral where cows grazed. Miriam looked at that scene and let out a small breath. Jonas spoke up, his voice calm, not too big, but enough so you don't step on each other's toes. Miriam nodded. "It looks peaceful." The words were small, but Jonas heard in them an indescribable relief. He held out his hand to help her down. This time, though still trembling, she did not pull away. It was a small sign, but to Jonas it was a rare gift of trust. Inside the cabin, Miriam stood tall in the middle of the main room. Everything was simple but warm: a pine table, 2 chairs, a black stove, Jonas's bed in the corner. The wood was honey-colored and polished with age. Jonas pointed to a small door on the right. "You have your own room. I cleaned it yesterday. I hope it's clean enough." Miriam entered the room. It was small, only 8 feet wide, but it had a window that looked out onto the fields. A single bed, a yellow wool blanket, an old wooden chest of drawers. In the twilight the room had a simplicity so profound it almost brought her to tears. "Thank you," Miriam said, turning back. I didn't expect to have my own place. I thought—" She was silent. Jonas understood. "Don't worry. I know you've had a hard time. Just take a breather." Miriam bowed her head, her eyes glistening. She wasn't crying, she seemed to have run out of tears, but her gratitude was evident. Dinner that night was simple: the beef stew Jonas had cooked that morning, some bread and black coffee. Miriam sat across from him at the table. The oil lamplight illuminated her face, making the bruise stand out. Jonas tried not to stare, but her blue eyes, even in their darkness, made him want to know more about this woman. The atmosphere was a little awkward. Jonas tapped his spoon against the side of his bowl. "I'm not much of a cook. If this is too difficult to eat, I'll—" Miriam shook her head, interrupting very gently. "It tastes good. It's been a long time since I've had a proper meal." Jonas did not answer. He only nodded, but something in his chest ached. Such a simple meal was a luxury for her. They ate in silence. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 strangers trying to find their footing in a new life. While Miriam washed the dishes, Jonas stepped out onto the porch, sat in an old wooden chair, and looked up at the night sky. The Wyoming sky in spring was always breathtakingly beautiful. No houses crowded together, no town lights blotting out the stars. Just darkness so vast it dwarfed people. Jonas placed his hands on his knees, his fingers tapping lightly as if in thought. The cabin felt different today. It wasn't as cold as usual, as if the wind were piercing through his bones. It wasn't as if the wood creaked with loneliness. There was another presence, a slight presence, but enough to change the rhythm of the house, and because of that Jonas felt a lingering fear. What if she leaves? What if her past finds her way here? And what if he starts to care too much? He shook his head, as if to clear it. The only thing he was sure of was this: Miriam needed peace, and he would give it to her, though he didn't know what it would cost. That night, Jonas lay in his familiar bed, but he had more trouble sleeping than usual. He heard the wind whistling through the cracks in the door, the stamping of the cattle in the pasture, and a very faint sound from Miriam's room. Not crying. Just the sound of someone tossing and turning, sighing, then silence. He looked up at the ceiling, his eyes narrowed. "May she sleep peacefully," he whispered. A moment later, he got out of bed, took a cup of warm water, and placed it gently in front of Miriam's door. He didn't knock, didn't call her name. He just quietly returned to bed. That's how he shows his concern. Small, discreet, not embarrassing. And strangely, when Jonas lay back down on the bed, he felt lighter, as if doing that little thing made him feel less alone. The next morning the sun was shining through the window. Jonas came out of his room and found Miriam lighting a fire in the kitchen. Her hair was tied back, and her expression was not as bewildered as it had been the night before. "Good morning," she said, her voice warmer. "I made some coffee. Hope you don't mind." Jonas stood still for a second. It had been a long time since he had heard that in this house. A good morning, a woman's voice, a sense of family. He nodded. "I don't mind. Actually, thank you." Miriam smiled slightly the first time since meeting him. Not a full smile, just a fleeting softness. But it lit the room brighter than the sun. Jonas sat down and watched Miriam set her coffee cup on the table. Her hands were still shaking slightly, but not with fear as they had last night. Perhaps because something new was stirring. After breakfast they walked out into the courtyard together. Miriam looked out at the green prairie covered in morning mist and took a deep breath. "It's not like where I used to live," she said. Jonas replied slowly. Here the wind is strong, the people are few, the land is vast. But if you pay attention, it heals many things. Miriam looked at him for a moment. There was something in his eyes as if she were trying to believe something too far-fetched. Then she said softly, I hope to find a way to start over. Jonas looked out at the field, his voice low and steady. If you want to start, this place will give you time. She didn't answer, but her shoulders relaxed, and for Jonas that was answer enough. There was a special silence on Jonas's farm in the afternoons. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a land so vast that every sound was absorbed into the earth before it could reach far. Miriam stood before the stables, her hands gently touching the old wood. The last sunlight fell on her hair, turning its dark brown to a pale honey. Jonas was repairing a section of fence that had been broken by the night's wind. His hammer struck the wood rhythmically. Not fast, not hard, but steady and sure. Miriam had a strange feeling watching him work, as if there was a calm rhythm to this man that she had long lost. Do you need any help? Miriam asked, her voice a little timid. Jonas paused, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. If you want, you can give me the remaining nails in that box. Miriam did as she was told. As she came closer, Jonas noticed that her hands, though soft, had small bumps. Not like the marks of someone who had worked hard. More like the marks of someone who had held her too tightly. Jonas didn't ask. He just took the nails from her. Thank you. Just a simple thank you, but to Miriam it made her feel less invisible than before. The afternoon was drawing to a close. When he had finished his work, Jonas took 2 wooden chairs and placed them on the porch. He poured water into 2 tin cups and placed one in front of Miriam. You don't have to do that, Miriam said, taking the cup. So, Jonas asked, overly polite. Jonas chuckled. I just thought you might need a break. Miriam lowered her eyes. Where I used to live, people weren't usually so caring. Jonas did not reply. Sometimes silence is the truest kindness. They sat together watching the prairie fade into darkness. A few hawks circled overhead. In the distance a cow lowed softly, mixed with the wind blowing through the dry grass. It was a sound Jonas had become accustomed to hearing over the past 10 years, but today it sounded different. Softer, less empty. After a long while, Miriam spoke first. I lived in Boston, she said, her voice low but clear. It was crowded, noisy, and had a lot of traffic. But despite the crowds, I never felt safe. Jonas turned to look at her profile. Her blue eyes gleamed in the twilight, but there was a fear deep within them that was forever unnamed. I used to teach, Miriam continued. Children they are so much more innocent and kind than adults. Jonas asked very slowly without pressing, Do you like that job? Yes. Miriam smiled slightly. It was the only time I felt useful. She was silent for a moment, then added, Before things changed. Jonas put his cup down. He didn't ask what happened as most people do. He just said one sentence very calmly. If you want to tell, I will listen. If not, that's your right too. Miriam looked at him, a little surprised by the respect. Then she turned away her eyes, following the distant mountains. I'm not ready, she said. But thank you for not pushing me. Jonas nodded. Here no one needs to hurry. A breeze blew, making Miriam's shawl flutter. She held it shivering. Jonas stood, walked into the cabin, took the thick woolen blanket, and draped it over her shoulders. The action made Miriam stiffen for a second, as if her body were used to retreating rather than advancing. You're cold, Jonas said simply. Thank you. Miriam pulled the blanket back, her voice so soft it almost disappeared into the wind. The cabin was warmer than usual that evening. Miriam made dinner from simple things she found in the cupboard, a few potatoes, some beef jerky, a few spices. When she set the plate on the table, Jonas looked at it for a long moment and then smiled. You cook much better than me. Miriam blushed and looked down. I just did it out of habit. When will you teach me? Jonas asked. Miriam laughed softly. It was a small, hesitant laugh, but so genuine it made Jonas feel as if a light had just come on in the cabin. After dinner, Miriam stood at the sink, washing the dishes, while Jonas cleared the table. Neither of them said a word, but the silence today was not distance, but the stillness of two people who know the other will not hurt them. Just before bedtime, Miriam passed Jonas's door to get some water. Hearing footsteps, Jonas looked up from the chair where he was sharpening his small knife. "Can you sleep?" he asked. Miriam stopped in front of her door. "I'm not used to this place, but it feels more peaceful than anywhere else I've been." Jonas looked down at the blade in his hand. "I don't know much about keeping people safe, but I'll try not to make this place more frightening to you." Miriam looked at him for a long moment. It was as if she were trying to discern whether Jonas's kind words were true or just a temporary favor. Then she said softly, "I believe you don't want to hurt anyone." Jonas looked up a little surprised by the trust. "Thank you," he replied. The next morning, Jonas led Miriam out to the small garden behind the cabin. It was just a few square yards planted with a few vegetables, but for Miriam, it was a place where she felt she could start again. "Do you know gardening?" Jonas asked. "I know a little. My mother taught me." Jonas handed her a pair of thin gloves. "If you want, you can tend these beds. If you don't, that's okay too." Miriam took the gloves, her eyes shining a little brighter. "No, I want to do it." As she knelt on the ground, Jonas noticed that her shoulders were less tense than they had been in previous sessions. She carefully pulled out clumps of weeds, adjusted the stumps of plants. Her eyes were focused, her hands light but precise, like someone who had practiced this work. The small scene made Jonas feel his heart slow down to a peaceful rhythm he hadn't experienced in a long time. One afternoon, while they were feeding their cows, a man from the town rode by on horseback. He called out Jonas. "There were some strangers asking questions at Willow Ridge yesterday. They were asking about a woman named Clark." Jonas stood still, his face expressionless. "Thank you," Jonas said. "I will keep an eye on it." The other man rode away. The wind returned to its original space. Miriam stood a few paces away. Though she tried to hide it, Jonas saw her hands grip the saddle so tightly that they turned white. Jonas said nothing more. He just put his hand on the back of the nearest bull to calm it, but really to calm himself. He turned to Miriam, his voice low and firm. "When you are ready to tell me, I will listen. If not, you have nothing to fear. Not here." Miriam looked at him. Her blue eyes were filled with gratitude but also with suppressed panic. She said softly, "Thank you, but I can't finish now." Jonas nodded very slowly. "No one is rushing you." And in that moment, in the pale afternoon light, amid the sound of the western wind, a small but important step happened. Miriam began to believe that she could be safe here. That morning, Wyoming was grayer than usual. A thick layer of clouds rolled over the mountaintops, blocking out the sunlight. The wind blew through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles, making the air heavier. Jonas looked up at the sky as he refilled the cow troughs. He sensed something not in the changing seasons but in the person standing near the stable door, Miriam. She had said nothing all morning. Not the usual silence, but the silence of someone who holds a secret too heavy. Jonas realized from the way her eyes averted whenever he happened to look at her. She was trying to hide something anxious, like holding a small bird in her hand, and fearing that letting go would hurt it. When Jonas finished his yard work, he stood near the porch, leaning against a wooden post and looking in Miriam's direction. She was cutting some greens from the backyard, but her movements were slow and distracted. Jonas stepped closer. "Are you okay?" Miriam turned around, slightly startled. A faint but forced smile appeared on her face. "Just a little tired." Jonas did not answer at once. He bent down and pulled some weeds around the vegetable patch, both to help and to make the conversation easier. "Tired from working or tired from thinking too much?" he asked softly. Miriam paused, her woolen gloves clenching. "I don't want to bother you with my past." Jonas tightened his cowboy hat and looked at her. "You're not bothering me, but if something's scaring you, you don't have to suffer alone." Miriam was silent for a moment at that. The wind blew a strand of hair out of her bun. She reached up to tuck it behind her ear, the movement hesitant. "Mr. Hale," she began, her voice low as if testing herself, "I am not an easy person to live with. I carry a lot of things that are not exactly baggage." Jonas set his gloves down on the wooden table nearby and sat on the edge of the porch. "If that's your concern, I understand. Everyone has things they'd like to forget. I do too." Miriam walked slowly up to the porch, standing a few steps away from him. You lost your wife. Right, Jonas paused. Not because it hurt, but because no one asked about it. Yes, he said, his voice low and slow. More than 10 years. But some wounds don't go away with time. Miriam pressed her hand lightly against her chest, as if to keep her heart from falling out. So, you understand that feeling. What feeling? Jonas asked. I feel like I'm not whole enough for anyone to need me anymore. Jonas was silent. Silence long enough for Miriam to think he was not going to say anything more. But then Jonas stood up and came closer to her, but still at a respectful distance. Miss Clark, he said, his voice low and warm, one does not have to be whole to be worthy of someone. One only has to be sincere. For the first time, Miriam looked straight at him. Her blue eyes wavered like the surface of water about to break. That afternoon, Miriam helped Jonas clean out the chicken coop. Though the task was simple, she was still a little clumsy, as if she were not used to handling a shovel and bucket. Jonas stood a few feet away, watching her silently. He noticed something strange. Miriam always had her back to the road, leading to the farm, as if to avoid the direction where someone might appear unexpectedly. Are you afraid someone will come looking for you? Jonas asked while feeding the chickens. Miriam started dropping a few seeds on the ground. Why do you ask? Because I see you're always wary of this road, Jonas replied. Like someone who's been on the run. Miriam took a half step back, her hands clasped together. I don't know what to say. Jonas stepped closer, putting down his shovel. You don't have to say anything. But if you're in danger, I need to know to protect you. You don't have to protect me, Miriam said quickly, but her voice was clearly shaking. I've survived alone for months. I don't want anyone dragged into this because of me. Her voice was tight, a small, distant sound. Jonas saw in her not just fear but guilt and shame, worry that she was a burden. Miriam, Jonas said, using her name for the first time. Her name sounded deep, warm, and solid as the ground in his voice. If you're running from someone, you don't have to face it alone. Miriam looked at him as if she couldn't believe someone would say such a thing so simply. That night, the wind whistled through the cabin's planks. Jonas sat at the table sharpening a fruit knife. But his mind was not on the blade, it was on Miriam, in the way she bowed her head whenever she remembered the past. In the way she flinched at sounds that others didn't notice, in the bruises that hadn't healed yet on her gaunt face. What have you been through, Miriam? Jonas thought, his hand stopping mid-stroke. He wasn't the type to meddle in other people's affairs. But, with Miriam, he found himself unable to stand idly by. He didn't know if it was out of pity, or duty, or some other lingering emotion. He just knew that if her past returned, he wouldn't let it win. He rose and went to Miriam's door. The light from under the door showed that she was still awake. Jonas started to knock, then changed his mind. Instead, he placed a lit oil lamp and a fresh glass of water on the table by the door, a habit he had begun the first day she arrived. Just as he was about to turn away, he heard a slight noise inside the room. The door opened slightly. Miriam stood there, her hair loose in a few strands, her face pale but her eyes clear. Mr. Hale, she said softly. I can say some of it, not all of it, but some of it. Jonas did not hurry or seem pleased. He simply nodded. I hear. Miriam looked down, caught her breath and said, I left Boston because they wanted to trap me in a life I didn't choose. I was forced, controlled, and when I resisted they used violence to silence me. Jonas squeezed his hand lightly. You were beaten for resisting, Miriam nodded, her eyes filling with tears. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is, no one believes me. No one thinks a woman can make her own decisions. She took a deep breath. I ran, and I never stopped running. Until I got here. Jonas didn't say any of those platitudes like, it'll be okay. Such words are often inadequate to the wounded. Instead, he asked, Is anyone looking for you? Miriam was silent. Her silence was her answer. Jonas looked deep into her eyes, then spoke very slowly, each word clearly. Here no one touches you if you don't want them to. And if anyone comes looking for you, they have to go through me first. Miriam did not cry, but her lips trembled as if she wanted to say something but did not have the strength to say it. After a few seconds she let out a soft breath. Thank you, Jonas. His name and her voice sounded like the first trust she had dared to give in years. When Jonas returned to his room, he found his heart beating more slowly, not from anxiety, but from a clear decision. Maybe he didn't know all of Miriam's past. Maybe he didn't know what dangers lay ahead. But he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't let her run anymore. No matter what happens, he will stand by her side. And for a rancher who lived his life by perseverance, that silent promise carried as much weight as an oath. In the days that followed that night's conversation, Miriam seemed to change in small but noticeable ways. She was still quiet, still startled by unexpected sounds, but there was something softer in her eyes, as if she had allowed herself to believe in a little peace in this wilderness. Jonas realized this when he saw Miriam rise earlier, go into the kitchen before him, to light the stove, prepare a pan of black coffee, and do some simple dishes. Not out of duty, but because she wanted to do something every day, something normal, something her old life had deprived her of. This morning was no different. When Jonas opened his door, the cabin was filled with the smell of freshly baked cornbread. Miriam stood with her back to him, blowing gently on a piece to test its heat. Beside her was a pan of freshly stirred bacon. Her hair was tied back, a few strands falling around the nape of her neck. It was a very ordinary sight, but to Jonas it was the sight that brought the house back to life. "Good morning," he said. Miriam paused for a second, as if still not used to someone answering her every morning, but then gave a small smile. "Good morning, Jonas. I made some cornflakes. I hope you don't mind." "Never mind. I think I've eaten much less delicious things," he replied, his voice soft but matter-of-fact. Miriam chuckled, a smile that warmed the room more than the fire in the stove. They ate breakfast at the old wooden table, making small talk about the weather, the cows, and the upcoming need to check the porch before the rainy season. Everything was simple, slow, like the heartbeat of the West. But for Miriam, these were precious moments that she did not dare believe she would experience again in her life. After breakfast, Jonas prepared to go to the paddock. But when he reached the door, he saw Miriam standing on the porch, looking out toward the path that led to town. Her face was slightly tense, and her hand was playing with the edge of her dress, as if trying to hide a quiet worry. "Are you thinking about the other day again?" Jonas asked, coming to stand beside her. Miriam didn't turn to look at him. "I try, but sometimes I'm afraid that one day they'll come." Jonas did not ask who they were. He understood that sometimes people cannot name their darkness. "I'm here," he said softly, "and I don't think this town is easy for anyone to mess around in." Miriam nodded slightly, but her face was still slightly tense. "Jonas," she began, hesitating, "do you ever feel this peace that isn't real, just too good to be true?" Jonas looked out at the prairie, stretching to the horizon, then sighed. "I think peace is the hardest thing to believe. But when it comes, don't push it away." Miriam turned to look at him. There was gratitude in her eyes, confusion in her eyes, fear in her eyes, but also hope in her eyes. They worked in the yard at noon. Miriam helped Jonas clean out the woodshed in the back. It was old and dusty. Its shelves were filled with things Jonas had left untouched for years. Saddle-making tools, some old ropes, a jacket he had worn when he was young. While unpacking, Miriam accidentally dropped a small wooden box. It fell to the ground with a heavy, strange sound. It did not sound like the normal sound of wood falling. Jonas looked down. "That box isn't mine." Miriam froze. Her face paled slightly. She bent down and picked up the box with both hands, lifting it as if it were something fragile. The box was made of walnut with a metal clasp at the front and was no larger than the palm of her hand. Jonas looked into her eyes. "That yours?" Miriam clutched the box to her chest. "Yes. What's in it?" She was silent, just hugged tighter, breathing faster. "Miriam," Jonas asked, his voice low with genuine concern for the first time, "I don't need to know if you don't want to tell me. But if it scares you, you don't have to hide it from me." Miriam shook her head very slightly. "I can't open it." "Not now." Jonas didn't press. "Would you like me to put it somewhere safer?" Miriam looked at him for a few seconds. Then she shook her head. "I'll keep it. If it's okay, would you mind if I kept it in my room?" Jonas nodded. "Of course." But as Miriam walked away with the box in her arms, he felt a chill run down his spine. Not because of fear, but because he knew that there was something so important in that box that Miriam would rather tremble and hold it than hand it over to anyone. Not a small secret. A secret that can stir up a storm. In the evening, as the sun began to set, Jonas and Miriam sat on the front porch steps. The last light of day dyed the prairie a lingering orange-yellow so beautiful that it made one forget one's sorrows for a moment. "Do they have sunsets like this in Boston?" Jonas asked. Miriam smiled sadly. "There is only factory smoke and the sound of horse-drawn carriages. I have never seen such a vast expanse of sky. Do you like it, I think?" Miriam looked into the distance, her voice as light as a breath. "Perhaps for the first time in years I feel like I can breathe without fear of being heard." Jonas looked at her profile in the last light of the sun. The bruises were lighter but still enough to show how painful they had been. What Jonas noticed more, however, was the look in her eyes, like candles flickering in the wind, weak but still burning. He said nothing. He didn't want to make the moment heavy. But he thought to himself, "I wish this peace would follow her for a long time." At night, Jonas sat before the fire, mending a frayed rein. Miriam sat a few feet away, mending a handkerchief. Neither spoke, but their presence warmed the house. After a moment, Miriam looked up. "Jonas, thank you for today." "For what? Because?" "Don't ask too much." Jonas smiled slightly. "I think people only tell when they are willing." Miriam nodded slightly. "I hope one day I can tell you everything." Jonas replied simply, "When you are ready, I will be here." Before going to bed, Miriam went into her room with the small wooden box in her hand, but for the first time, instead of putting it away immediately, she stood for a long time in front of the window, looking out into the darkness. "If I open it, everything will change," she thought. "If I don't open it, it will still be there like a shadow that follows." She put the box on the table, sat down on the edge of the bed, and hugged her slightly trembling hands. Not because she was afraid of the past, but because she was starting to fear losing the peace she had just reached. She spoke very softly, like a confession to the darkness. "I hope you don't have to pay for letting me stay." In the next room, Jonas sat by the window watching the small light under Miriam's door. He knew she was awake. He knew she was worried. He knew she was carrying something she did not dare face. And Jonas made a silent decision. No matter what Miriam said or didn't say, he would stand by her. Because sometimes silence is a person's way of saying, "Please don't leave me." And Jonas Hale is not one to abandon anyone, especially someone trying to find a way out of his life. The week passed in a quiet but warm rhythm. Miriam grew accustomed to waking up to the smell of coffee, to the dusty western wind on her cheeks, to Jonas's slow footsteps on the wooden floor each morning. These little things created a rhythm of life she had never known before, a rhythm of order, of breath, of hope. This morning, Jonas decided to ride into Willow Ridge to pick up some supplies. Miriam stood on the porch, her hands lightly gripping the edge of a wooden post. She looked calm, but her eyes betrayed her true feelings. "Are you sure you don't need me to come with you?" she asked softly. Jonas adjusted the reins. "You don't have to go anywhere if you don't want to. I'm just going to get some nails and flour and ask around." "What are you asking about?" Miriam asked, her eyes widening slightly. Jonas did not hide. "A few days ago, someone said that there were strangers in town asking questions. I want to know who they are." Miriam bowed her head. Her shoulders shook ever so slightly. Jonas did not miss it. He stepped closer, keeping his voice low and steady. "Don't worry. I just want information. No one there has any reason to suspect or tell anyone." Miriam looked up, her blue eyes sparkling with unease. "I was just afraid. If they really came looking for you, you would get in trouble because of me." Jonas placed his hand on the edge of the column, keeping his distance, but close enough for her to hear the certainty in his voice. "Miriam, you didn't bring trouble here. Trouble follows you, but I won't let it take you away from this place." She did not answer, but her gaze softened. Jonas mounted his horse, promising to return before evening. Willow Ridge was always bustling on a Tuesday morning. The sound of wagon wheels, people calling from the shops, cuckoos on the power lines. Everything blended into a rhythm Jonas had long since become accustomed to hearing. As he dismounted, he felt a few eyes on him. Jonas was familiar with such looks. News in small towns traveled faster than the wind, and the fact that he had picked up a strange woman with no family, no story, was enough to stir up gossip. But Jonas paid it no mind. Westerners were accustomed to everyone having a past. He entered Mr. Bill Harper's grocery store. The wooden door creaked with familiarity. Bill looked up from the counter. "Jonas, I hear you have someone living with you." Jonas was straightforward. "Yes. Her name is Miriam Clark. She's nice," Bill said. "But 2 people came in the other day asking about a woman. Didn't give a name, but the description was pretty similar." Jonas stopped picking nails. "Which 2?" Bill frowned, trying to remember. "Not from around here. One was tall, thin, in a black hat. The other was shorter, with an Eastern accent. They asked around, then went to the pub, then Mr. Rose. They left town yesterday, north. But I don't know where." Jonas kept his face calm, though his chest tightened. "Did they leave their names?" "No. But they look like people looking for debt. The kind of people who don't come here to buy horses." Bill looked closely at Jonas. "Is she in trouble, Jonas?" "If there is, that's my business," Jonas replied in a low, even voice. Bill nodded, understanding. He asked no more questions. On the way back, Jonas took his time. The early morning wind blew hard, blowing the smell of hay into his face, making him concentrate better. Jonas had images of the 2 strangers in his mind, tall, thin, black-capped, with Eastern accents. Boston was also in the east. He tugged on the reins. "They are looking for her." Jonas was not afraid for himself. He was afraid only for Miriam. She had carried her fear like a long shadow over her every step. Now the shadow was coming closer. As the cabin appeared on the horizon, Jonas saw Miriam hanging laundry out to dry in the backyard. The wind blew her skirts, but the first thing Jonas noticed wasn't the sight, it was the feeling in his chest that lightened a little. It was like seeing her there confirmed that the current peace had not been taken away. Miriam heard the sound of horse steps and turned. When she saw Jonas, she smiled a faint but genuine smile. "You came back earlier than I expected." "I always try to keep my word." Jonas dismounted. "I got what we needed." Miriam's eyes studied him for a long moment, as if she were trying to read what news he had brought. Jonas saw it, the anticipation mixed with fear. They said nothing more until they entered the cabin. Jonas put the bag on the table. Miriam stood opposite him, wiping her hands with a towel. "What did you hear in town?" Jonas didn't want to alarm her. But he wasn't the type to hide the truth from someone who needed to know. "There are 2 strangers asking around town," he said bluntly. "They fit your description." Miriam's face turned ashen. "Mr. Bill said they left town and headed north. But—" Jonas looked deep into her eyes. "I don't think they'll give up." Miriam sat down in a chair by the fireplace. She placed her hands on her knees and clasped them. A second later she said softly, "I knew they would come. I just didn't think it would be so soon." Jonas pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. "Miriam, you don't have to face this alone." She shook her head. "You don't understand. Those people, they don't want to lose what they think they own." "I don't care what they think," Jonas said, his voice low but firm. "No one owns you." Miriam looked up, her blue eyes wet. Not from weakness, but because it was the first time anyone had said that to her. "Jonas," she whispered. "If they come here, they won't let you off the hook. I don't want you hurt because of me." Jonas replied immediately, as if what he said was instinct rather than thought. "If they come with bad intentions, I won't let them near you." Miriam clutched the edge of her shirt, trying to keep her composure. "You don't need to protect me. Not because I need to," Jonas said, "but because I choose to." The words made Miriam bow her head. A small tear fell onto her hand, but she did not wipe it away. Silence filled the room like a thick blanket, not tense but heavy, because the truth could no longer be avoided. A long while later, when the wind blew harder outside the door, Miriam spoke. "They will come someday. I don't know when, but they won't stop." Jonas looked straight at her. "When they come, I'll be here." "That doesn't guarantee anything," Miriam said through ragged breaths. They're not like normal people." Jonas leaned forward. "Then tell me who they are." Miriam clenched her hands, her nails digging into her skin. I can't finish now." At least tell me what I need to know before it's too late, Jonas said, his voice soft but firm. Miriam looked at him for a long moment. Pain, fear, and apology were evident in her eyes. "In the wooden box," she whispered, "there is something they want, and something I dare not look back at." Jonas was silent. It was the first time Miriam had acknowledged that the box was not just a keepsake, but the eye of the storm. "Jonas," Miriam said, her voice falling to the center of the room, "if they find me, they will take it, and then everything will change." Jonas replied with the only word she could cling to, "I won't let that happen." And in that moment Jonas knew that their peace had begun to count down, not because they were weak, but because the darkness had realized Miriam no longer belonged to it. The Wyoming wind was stronger than usual that day. The low clouds stretched in long bands as if torn from the sky by the wind. Jonas stood on the porch, arms folded across his chest, watching the prairie sway in the wind in the distance. He sensed something strange in the air, like when a wild animal knows someone is silently watching it from the bushes. Inside the cabin, Miriam was preparing dinner. The light click of a knife on a cutting board, the crackling of a fire in the stove, the wind blowing through the cracks in the door, all of it combined into a peaceful cacophony so fragile that the slightest truth could shatter it. Jonas turned back to look out the window. Miriam stood there, her shoulders slightly hunched, as if she were always trying to keep herself from letting what she carried bother others. But Jonas knew that her stubbornness made him want to protect her all the more. As he entered the cabin, Miriam looked up. "You're back sooner than I thought," she said. "I want to check the fence," Jonas replied, hanging his hat on a peg. "The wind is strong this afternoon. It may rain heavily tonight." She nodded, her eyes averted for a moment. Jonas saw her awkwardness, as if she were holding a great decision in her heart. He walked to the table, put his hands on the back of his chair, and looked at her for a long moment. "Miriam, if there is something bothering you, you don't have to hide it." The words stopped Miriam immediately. She put down the knife, clasping her hands together. Jonas felt his chest tighten, not because he was nervous about what she was about to say, but because he knew she had struggled to say it. "Jonas," she said softly, "it's time I showed you what's in the box." Jonas did not appear surprised. He simply nodded as if this were something he had long planned. "If you are ready," he said, "I am here." Miriam went into her room. The sound of the small iron lock was faint, but to Jonas it sounded like the beginning of a new chapter. When she emerged, the wooden box was in her hands, her eyes cast down as if she dared not look at it. She set the box on the table. "I ran away not because I was being controlled, but because I carried something they wanted at all costs." Jonas sat down opposite, waiting. Miriam unlocked the small lock. It made a dry click, like an old door finally opening after years of being locked. The box isn't full, just a few things times. A thin stack of discolored paper. Asterisk. An old gold ring. Asterisk. A small photograph of a man about 40 years old. Asterisk. And a letter folded very carefully. Miriam looked at those, then at Jonas. It all started with these. Jonas didn't touch anything. He let Miriam take the lead in this story. She pulled the letter forward. "This is from my mother. I found it after she died." Her voice trembled, but her eyes no longer evaded. "My mother wrote that I was not the biological child of the man who raised me for many years," she said. "My father was someone else, someone she loved, but was not allowed to be with." She opened the letter. Jonas saw that the handwriting was soft, but hurried, as if the writer were struggling between love and fear. "My mother wrote that my biological father was a big businessman in Boston. This secret she kept to protect me, but when I grew up he came looking for me." Jonas tilted his head, his eyes sharp. "Because you have the right to inherit," Miriam sighed. "He was rich, Jonas, very rich, but he had no legitimate children. When my mother died, all traces of the past were buried. Only this box remained." She pointed to the yellowed paper. "This is the adoption certificate my stepfather gave me when I was a child. But there's something wrong with it. A signature is wrong. A stamp is changed." She handed over another item, a photo of a middle-aged man. "This is my biological father. He sought me out a year ago, wanting me to come live with him to legitimize our relationship. He said it was for his reputation, to complete his life. Miriam clenched her hands until they turned white. "But I don't want to. I'm used to my limited freedom. I don't want to go into a house where every wall says I don't belong." Jonas understood. Too well. And he wouldn't accept that refusal. He not only refused, Miriam said, her voice low. He was furious, and his estate manager, the ruthless man behind the scenes, used force to force me back. Jonas placed his hands on the table slowly but firmly. He did not touch hers, but Miriam felt his protection like warmth on a cold night. "Bruises," Jonas said. "Yes," Miriam replied. "From them." She pointed to the papers in the box. "These prove that I have no obligations to them. On the contrary, they prove that the manager forged the papers to keep the entire inheritance for himself." Jonas clenched his jaw. "So they followed you to get the papers in this box back?" "Yes. If they get it, I will not only lose my freedom, but also the proof that I am not lying." Jonas took a deep breath. "Why don't you see a lawyer? Because in Boston, they have power." "More than I thought, and all I could do was run." She looked at Jonas, her blue eyes filled with the weariness of months of living in fear. "When I chose to sign a mail-order bride contract, I just wanted to go somewhere far enough away that they would give up. But I didn't expect they would still want to chase me." Jonas looked at the box, then at Miriam. He knew then that this was more than a coincidence. This was the intersection of two tested lives. And Jonas, with the intuition of a rancher who had lived in the wilderness all his life, knew that from now on, he would no longer be an outsider. "Miriam," he said, his voice low and warm as the firelight, "you don't have to face this alone anymore." Miriam looked up. "But they will come." "I know." Jonas did not dodge. "And I will prepare." She looked at him a long time as if searching for any hesitation in his eyes, but she found nothing but calm and determination. "Jonas," she said softly, "I didn't ask you to do that." "I know," Jonas replied, a small smile flickering. "But sometimes you choose to stand by someone before they know they deserve to be on your side." A tear fell onto Miriam's hand, but this time it was not from fear. It was from relief. She closed the box, her hand resting on the lid for a long time, as if thanking it for giving her the courage to say everything. Then she handed the box to Jonas. "I want you to keep it," she said. Jonas didn't accept it right away. "Are you sure? It's part of your life?" Miriam nodded. "I believe you." Jonas put his hand on the box, not because of the box, but because of the words. It touched his chest like a silent oath. Outside, a strong wind blew against the window. The cabin shook slightly. The storm was coming. And now Jonas knew it was more than just a storm in the sky. The morning after the wooden box was opened, the atmosphere of the farmhouse changed in an indescribable way. Nothing was obviously unusual. The day was like any other. The sun rose from the hills, the cows called to each other with a low moo. Oakley's horse tapped its hoofs lightly on the dry ground. But amid all the familiarity, there was one thing that made Jonas linger longer than usual at the cabin door. It was that feeling. Something was coming. Not the wind, not the season, not the storm, but the people. Jonas had lived long enough in this land to understand small changes in the steppe often signaled something much larger. Miriam was making breakfast when Jonas returned. The light from the window fell on her shoulders, softening her hair. But though she tried to keep her composure, Jonas could see the delicate tension in her shoulders. She had tried to sleep last night, but every little noise from outside, wind cows kicking the fence, the rustle of grass made her jolt awake as if the past were calling her name. She put the plate of eggs on the table. "Can you sleep?" "Not much," Jonas replied. "What about you?" Miriam shook her head slightly. I fear what will come more than I fear not knowing when it will come." Jonas understood. Sometimes vague fear was worse than the stark truth. They ate breakfast in silence. Then Jonas folded up his chairs, put on his heavy coat, and prepared to go out and check the barricades. Miriam stood near the door looking at him as if she wanted to say something, but then said nothing. Jonas saw the anxiety on her face, but did not press her. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked, his hand on the doorknob. "I will try," she replied. "But if you see anything strange, please come back inside." Jonas smiled slightly. "I won't run from anything." but I will pay attention." As he walked out, Miriam stared after him for a long time, as if his back was the only thing that made her feel like she was not out of place. The farm was as quiet that morning as ever, but the closer Jonas got to the property line, the more he realized something was wrong. There were footprints, not cows, not horses, but it is human footprints. 2 pairs, deep, long strides, one pair heavy and steady, one pair dragging slightly. Jonas knelt down and touched the ground with his fingers. The soil was still damp from the night dew, which must have been there within the last few hours. He straightened and looked toward the northern hills. The wind carried the rustling of grass, but there were no footsteps, no voices, no horses, only traces. Jonas stood still for a long time, as if listening to something inaudible to normal people. Something deep in the silence. Someone came near his farm during the night, and they were careful enough not to make any other noise. He walked slowly back to the cabin, but his heart was heavy, not out of fear. Jonas did not know fear that way. But when he loved something, he was afraid of losing it. Miriam is that. When Jonas entered the cabin, Miriam was folding the tablecloth. Seeing the look on his face, she stopped short. "What is it?" she asked, her voice laced with fear before she knew the answer. Jonas took off his hat and placed it on the wooden table. "Someone came near the boundary last night." Miriam paled. "They came here, not very far," Jonas said, "but they made their way there. I saw footprints leading toward the cabin but stopping at the north fence." Miriam placed her hand on her chest, trying to steady her breathing. "They're scouting." Jonas nodded slowly. "They know you're in the area, but they don't know exactly where." Miriam hugged her arms, trembling slightly. "If they find me, Jonas, Jonas stepped closer, not touching her but close enough that his voice rang warm as an oven. "Miriam, listen to me." She looked up, her blue eyes wide and filled with worry. "You're not going anywhere," Jonas said clearly. "If they come, I'll face them. You don't have to run anymore." His voice offered no empty promises, just the truth of someone who had suffered enough loss to know the value of standing up for someone. Tears welled in Miriam's eyes, though she tried to hold them back. "Why are you doing this for me?" Jonas looked at her, his eyes sharp but warm. "Because you deserve someone to stand by you. And because I chose to." That simple sentence made Miriam turn away, wiping her tears with her sleeve. After a moment she took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "Jonas," she said, her voice soft but no longer trembling. "There was something else in the box. I haven't shown you yet." Jonas looked at her, waiting. Miriam went into her room and returned with a small piece of paper folded in 4. It was an old piece of paper, but so carefully kept that every crease was straight. "This," she said, setting it down on the table, "is why they were willing to chase me all the way west." Jonas opened the paper. It was a transfer of property, but the heir section had 2 signatures times. One of Miriam's biological father, *, one of Miriam. But Jonas immediately recognized that Miriam's signature was not her signature today. "This signature," he said. "Part of it is my real signature," Miriam whispered. "But the rest is a forced signature. And the estate manager, that man, wanted to erase the truth." Jonas folded the paper. "You kept it all this time." "Yes," Miriam replied, "but I don't know if it will be enough to fight them." "You don't have to fight them," Jonas said. "It's not you anymore." The words left Miriam stunned for a moment. Then she sat down in the chair, as if some of her weight had been lifted. That afternoon Jonas went around checking every window, every bolt, every fence. Not that loneliness would prevent anything major, but that he would feel ready. Miriam watched him work, her heart both warm and aching. In Boston, no one stood by her. No one asked what she was afraid of. No one told her, "You are not alone." Now this silent man, the one who lived in the middle of the desolate steppe, the one who spoke so little that people thought he was cold, was the only one who saw her fear without turning away. When Jonas returned to the cabin before sunset, Miriam said, "Jonas, if you want, I can leave. I don't want to put this place in danger." Jonas looked straight at her. "The longer you leave, the easier it will be for them to find you. And I won't let anyone chase you off this farm." He placed his rough hand on the table next to Miriam's, not touching but close. "You are no one's property," He paused. "And you are no burden." Miriam bit her lip to stop a sob. "Thank you, Jonas." The window frame shook slightly in the strong wind. Jonas looked out at the darkening prairie. "Miriam," he continued, his voice low, "I need you to promise me something." "What?" "When something happens, you will be by my side. No running, no hiding." Miriam looked at him a long time. Her face reflected the firelight, making her blue eyes as deep as the bottom of a winter well. "I promise," she said. And that promise, in the middle of the small kitchen, amid the sound of the western wind, was the starting point of the inevitable storm. The next 3 days passed in a vague tension. Jonas said little, but Miriam sensed a change in him. He rose earlier, checked the fence more often, rebuilt the woodpile near the cabin, as if preparing for winter, though winter was still far off. Miriam knew these things were not routine. They were the instincts of a man used to facing danger, to do whatever he could, however small, to tell himself he was ready. As for her, every time she heard the strong wind through the door, her heart would clench. Every time the shadow of a large bird passed by the window, she would startle. But Jonas's presence always calmed her. The way he entered the room, the way he checked the door, the way he spoke short but firm sentences, all of it gave her a feeling she had never had before. Feeling protected, not like a puppet being controlled, but as a valuable human being. On the morning of the 4th day, as Miriam was drawing water from the well for her lunch, Jonas returned from the field with a brisker pace than usual. His face was expressionless, but the tension in his jaw was enough to make Miriam put down the bucket immediately. "Jonas," she asked, her voice dropping involuntarily. "What's wrong, Jonas?" Shook the dust off his coat and walked straight onto the porch. "Someone came over the south hill," he said. "I saw hoof prints. Not Oakley's or the horses around here." Miriam felt as if the bucket beside her had doubled in weight. "They came back." Jonas did not answer at once. He stood on the porch, looking down the path leading to the farm, his eyes sharp as knives. "I didn't see them," he said finally. "But someone was riding toward this area. They didn't come onto my land, but the tracks are fresh." Miriam took a half step back, her hands clasped together. Jonas turned back, his voice low but clear. "They're closer than before." That simple statement made Miriam hold onto the wall for balance. At noon, Jonas decided not to let Miriam out of the cabin. He did not force her with words. Jonas was not the type to give orders. But he put his hand on the doorframe and said, "It's windy today. It's better to stay indoors." Miriam understood. There was no argument. She helped prepare lunch, pea soup, some potatoes, stale bread reheated to keep warm. Jonas ate less than usual, and Miriam ate just a few spoonfuls and put the spoon down. No one said aloud what they all thought danger was at the edge of the fence. After lunch, Miriam stood by the window, her hand lightly touching the curtains. "Jonas, do you think they will find this place?" Jonas was refastening his saddle. "If they want to find out, they will. But this place is big, and I won't let them walk through the door unprepared." Miriam looked at him, her eyes a mixture of fear and gratitude. "I don't want you to fight or take risks because of me." Jonas stopped, stood up straight, and looked at her for a long time. "Miriam, I don't go looking for trouble. But when trouble comes looking for me, I won't stand behind anyone." Those words seemed to add a layer of protection around her. Not the kind that would lock her in a cage, but the kind that made her feel worthy of standing in the light. The afternoon came earlier than usual, the clouds rolling in low gray. Jonas left the cabin to check the stables. Miriam sat by the window, mending a frayed hem of her dress. She tried to concentrate on each stitch, but her eyes kept glancing toward the dirt road. And then something made her heart stop for a beat. A figure stands on the hill. Not close enough to make out a face, but close enough to see the stance, upright, motionless, as if watching. It wasn't someone passing by. It was someone waiting. Miriam jumped up. Jonas. He appeared seconds later, striding from the stable to the door. "What?" He looked in the direction Miriam was pointing. The figure stood there, not moving, not trying to hide, just standing like a black dot against the gray sky. Jonas immediately pulled Miriam back inside, closing the door but not latching it so he could watch through the crack in the glass. "You are here," he said softly but firmly. Is That them? Miriam asked, her voice shaking like a strained string. I don't know, Jonas replied. But I'll go and see. Miriam grabbed his sleeve. Jonas, don't. He put his hand on her shoulder, his gaze strangely calm. I won't go far, and I won't let them near you. He let go of her hand very slowly so that she could understand that he was choosing for her, not out of competitiveness or stubbornness. Jonas stepped out into the yard. Miriam stood behind the window, her heart pounding in her chest. Jonas walked to the center of the yard, standing tall, not flinching. The stance was not one of defiance, it was a statement: this was my territory. The figure on the hill seemed to notice Jonas's presence. He stood still for a few seconds, then slowly turned his horse and disappeared behind the pines. Jonas waited a little longer until he was sure he was far away. Then he returned to the cabin. When he opened the door, Miriam ran back, her voice almost breathless with fear. Are they gone? Jonas nodded. He left the hill. But I don't think he happened to pass by. Miriam clutched her chest. They want me to be afraid, Jonas replied slowly. They want you to know they are coming. And they want to see who is standing next to you. She looked at him as if the world around her was too big for her to stand on. Jonas, I'm sorry. For all this. Jonas placed his hands on her shoulders, holding them gently. Miriam, he said, using her name for the first time with a strange warmth in his voice, it is not your fault that someone hurt you, and it is not your fault that you ran to save your life. His voice was as deep as the wind from the mountains. If anyone should apologize here, it is those who chased you all the way here. Miriam bowed her head, tears falling but no longer choking. Jonas, I'm scared, but I don't want to run anymore. Jonas squeezed her shoulder. Then I will stand here. Until the end. There was a long silence. In that silence, something changed. Miriam no longer saw Jonas as someone who had given her shelter. She looked at him as someone who stood with her on the side of light, despite the approaching darkness. That evening Jonas put the wooden box in a locked drawer in his room, not to hide Miriam but to keep it safe. When he returned to the living room, Miriam was sitting by the fire, her hands on her knees like someone waiting for something more than words. Jonas, she said softly, I have a question, if you don't mind. You say, if this gets worse, will you regret leaving me behind? Jonas looked straight at her, his blue-gray eyes as steady as the winter sky. No, he said, without thinking. Because sometimes life puts someone in your path just when you need to stand up for something. He paused, then continued, and I think you are that to me. Miriam put her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back a sob. And I've never had anyone stand by me like that. Jonas sat down in the chair opposite. Now I have. Outside, the wind whipped through the eaves. The actual storm was still on its way, but its shadow had reached the threshold, and they both knew the day of confrontation would come. Soon, the Wyoming prairie looked strange that night. There was no moon, no stars, just darkness that lay like a heavy blanket over everything. The wind blew in gusts, cold and dry, carrying the scent of earth and foreboding. In the cabin, Jonas did not sleep. He sat with his back against the wall by the window, the Winchester rifle across his lap. The fire in the hearth had almost died down, leaving only a few red embers, like the eyes of an animal waiting for its chance. Miriam slept in the next room, but her sleep was light. Jonas could hear her shifting, her breathing coming in short, long breaths, the sound of someone trying to stay calm but too much anxiety. Jonas looked at his pocket watch. It was almost midnight. He sighed. If they were going to come, he whispered, they would choose a moment like this. Suddenly, a sound echoed from afar. Very small but clear enough for those familiar with the sounds of the West. The sound of horse hooves. Jonas stood up immediately without a moment's hesitation. Winchester in hand, he moved to the east window which overlooked the trail. The sound of hooves was getting closer. Not one, at least two, maybe three. They did not gallop. They moved slowly, as if their riders were surveying their surroundings and not wanting to make any noise. But the darkness hid the sound, could not hide the small tremors in the ground. Jonas tilted his head, listening. 1 beat, 2 beats. The hoofbeats beat steadily against the ground. 1 beat was heavy and powerful, like a tall man riding a well-trained horse. The other beat was lighter but consistent, possibly someone younger but with more power. Miriam appeared in the doorway, clad only in a thin shawl. "Jonas, I heard something." Her voice trembled despite her efforts to remain calm. Jonas raised his hand, signaling her to keep quiet. He said softly, low and steady, "Miriam, turn off the light." She did so immediately. In an instant the cabin was dark. Wind whistled through the cracks in the door. Jonas ordered her to stand back inside, away from the window. He looked out again. In the dim light, Jonas saw dark shapes moving in the distance. 3 horses. 2 were definitely riding them. The third, it was hard to say. It could be a sack. It could be someone tied up. Or just luggage. But Jonas did not trust the lightest. "Jonas," Miriam whispered. "They found this place." "Not sure," he replied. "But they want you to see them. Like tonight." A low, hoarse laugh rang out from the distance. Not a happy laugh, but the kind that comes when someone knows they are getting close to the prize. Jonas tightened his grip on the Winchester. "I'm going out." Miriam instinctively grabbed his sleeve. "No, they are dangerous. They are not like the people in this town." Jonas looked at her. His eyes were strangely calm, though the shadow covered his face. "Miriam, we can't let them think this place is easy to get into." He paused. "And I won't let you face them alone." Tears, not from fear, but from something more homey, flashed in Miriam's eyes. But she nodded. Jonas pulled on his coat and hat and opened the cabin door. The wind rushed in, cold as a knife. Miriam held the door shut and watched him descend the steps. The hooves stopped as Jonas stepped out into the dirt courtyard. 3 dark figures stood motionless, a dozen paces away. A tall man on a black horse sat upright and proud, as if accustomed to commanding others. Another on a brown horse was younger, his eyes sharp as knives, though Jonas could only see them dimly in the sunlight. The older man spoke first. "You are Jonas Hale." His voice was long, dry, and sharp as the cold wind cutting through the mountain pass. Jonas did not move. "I am Jonas." "Who are you?" he chuckled. "A man, searching for what belongs to him." Jonas didn't move, though his chest was starting to tighten. "I don't think anything here belongs to you." The man pursed his lips, then spoke as if giving an order to an invisible subordinate. "I know she is in there. Miss Miriam Clark." Jonas inclined his head very slightly. "No one here is owned by anyone else." The man laughed again, but this time his laughter did not hide his annoyance. "You don't understand, Mr. Hale. She's not a tramp. She's Jonas," interrupted him, his voice frighteningly even. "I know who she is." The man was silent for a second. Then he said, "So you know she was carrying something that didn't belong to her." Jonas didn't need to ask. He was talking about the box. She took what was hers. No one had the right to force her. A small sound came from behind Jonas. It might have been Miriam standing in the doorway. But he did not turn around. The man exhaled. "You want to be a hero, Mr. Hale, or do you think she loves you?" His voice was filled with contempt. Jonas did not take the bait. "I think he said you have gone too far from home to find trouble." The young man behind him took a step forward. "If you don't hand her over, we'll take her. And you'll be dragged into something that doesn't concern you." Jonas held the Winchester steady. "She lives here. That's my business." There was a moment of silence, as tense as a drawn bowstring. Then metallic sound. The young man drew his gun. Jonas didn't draw. He just raised his Winchester slightly, as the Westerners say, "We haven't shot yet, but I'm ready." The older man raised his hand, signaling the young man to stop. "Not tonight," he said. "Mr. Hale, I'll give you a chance. By noon the day after tomorrow, deliver her to me at Willow Ridge. If not, we will come back," he continued, his voice low and cold. "And we will not be as polite as tonight." Jonas kept his eyes unblinking. "I'm not handing anyone over." The man narrowed his eyes and nodded slightly, as if he had expected that answer. "Good. Then you have made your choice." He turned his horse, and the young man followed. The 3 horses left the farm slowly, as if he were in no hurry, as if the game had only just begun. Jonas stood there until their shadows faded into the night. Only then did he return to the cabin. The door opened before he could reach the steps. Miriam stood there, her face white. "What did they say?" she asked, her voice so hoarse it was like the wind had blown it away. Jonas looked at her, his eyes no longer cold as when facing an enemy. "They want me to hand you over to them." Miriam took a step back, her hands shaking. "Jonas, I can't. I won't let you get dragged into this." Jonas stepped forward and put his hand on her shoulder. "If you think I'm going to hand you over to them, you don't know me." Miriam burst into tears, not tears of frustration but of someone too tired to keep her worries inside. Jonas squeezed her shoulder. "They'll be back the day after tomorrow." He paused, speaking very slowly, "and I'll be here. Standing in this door. Next to you." Outside, the wind howled across the vast prairie. And in the small cabin in the middle of the prairie they both knew the real confrontation had begun. The next morning, as the Wyoming dawn touched the cabin roof, there was an unusual silence, not of peace, but of something compressed, ready to snap like an overdrawn bowstring. The air was colder, though there was no wind. The prairie before the house was as smooth as a winter lake. Jonas stood on the porch early. He looked out at the trail, stretching toward town, his deep eyes trying to read the future. Miriam watched him from the cabin, her heart aching. Jonas's face, though calm as usual, had something unusual, a fierce silence. The silence of a man who knows he cannot back down today. Miriam made coffee and brought it out onto the porch. "You haven't eaten," she said softly. Jonas took the coffee, his hand brushing hers. It was a brief touch, but enough to make Miriam feel her heart settle somewhat. "Thank you," Jonas said. They stood side by side for a long time, saying nothing more. Each of them had his own worries. But they both knew today was the day when darkness would pass into light. Jonas turned to her. "Miriam, if anything happens, I want you to remember something." She looked up. "What I didn't choose to stand next to you out of obligation," Jonas said, his voice low and slow. "I stood next to you because I wanted to." Miriam's chest tightened, and tears slid down her cheeks before she could stop them. "Jonas, you made me feel like I belonged. That was something I never dreamed of." Jonas put his hand on her shoulder, holding it lightly the way Western men say things they are not used to saying with words. "You belong here. At least, to me." That sentence on a cold Wyoming morning carried more weight than any declaration of love Miriam had ever heard. By midday the sky had turned a dull gray. No rain, no storm, just a pall of sadness over the sky. Jonas tried to keep things normal. He mowed the hay, fixed the stables, and cleaned up the woodpile as planned. But Miriam knew he did it to keep himself awake, to keep from getting lost in his thoughts. As for her, she cleared the table, folded the napkins, stacked the dishes, did every little thing to feel like she wasn't useless. But her hands trembled slightly, and every time the wind blew through the window her heart skipped a beat. When the sun was only halfway above the horizon, Jonas said, "They will come when it starts to get dark." Miriam swallowed the anxiety, rising in her throat. "Have you thought about what you will do?" Jonas nodded slowly. "I don't want to shoot anyone, but if they get over the fence I won't let them come near you." She stepped closer to him. "Jonas, they don't know how to stop. They'll do anything to get what they want, and they'll hurt you if you get in the way." Jonas looked at her closely. "Miriam, I'm not in the middle. I'm on the side." She covered her mouth to hold back a sob. "Sometimes I think, you're the only thing in my life that has never abandoned me." "Even if they come today," Jonas said, "I still won't leave." Darkness began to fall. The fireplace was lit. Jonas set the Winchester near the door, checked the ammunition, and placed a small oil lamp on the table to keep the cabin from being too bright. Bright light would make targets more visible. Miriam stood behind her hands clasped together. "Jonas," she said, her breath shaking. "What if they catch you?" Jonas turned. "I am stronger than I look. But there were 3 of them, and they had guns. I have something they don't." He paused. "I have reasons not to back down." Miriam's eyes fell on Jonas's, and between them in that moment of silence something was said without words. Then the sound of hooves. Hooves pounded the dry dirt. Beat 1, beat 2. Steady, slow, deliberate. Jonas stood up straight. "Come into my room," he said. "Lock the door." "No," Miriam shook her head, her eyes red. "I won't leave you alone." "Miriam, listen to me," Jonas said, his voice harder than usual. "If we are close together, we have the advantage. If you stay behind a locked door, I can concentrate." Miriam knew he was right. She backed away, her eyes never leaving his. "You promise? You won't do anything rash, not reckless," he replied. "Only necessary." She swallowed. "I believe you." Jonas nodded slightly. Miriam closed Jonas's door. He heard the lock turn. It was a small sound, but in the night it rang like a vow. 2 dark figures appeared in front of the fence, then a third, just like the night before, an old man, a young man, and another, on the back of a horse, either a lackey or just a distraction. The older man called out, "Mr. Hale, we have talked, now hand her over." Jonas opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch. "She's not a commodity," the man sneered. "You think you saved her? She brought property that doesn't belong to her. I just want to take back what should be mine." Jonas walked down a step. "She's carrying something that belonged to her mother, not yours." The man jerked at the reins and the horse turned a few times in annoyance. "What do you think you know about this? Do you think you know who she is?" Jonas did not move. "I know she is a person of many times greater respect than you." The young man drew his gun. "Enough!" Jonas raised the Winchester. "Don't." The older man raised his hand to stop him. "We won't shoot each other in front of your house. But I'll go in, and I'll take her." Jonas stepped down from the porch and stomped on the ground. "I don't recommend you try it." The man looked at Jonas for a long time, as if assessing whether Jonas was stubborn or willing to die. Finally he said, "Fine. I will take her the way she chose run, and I will start by destroying where you are standing." He signaled. The young man spurred his horse, preparing to charge into the fence. Jonas loaded the gun and cocked the trigger. "I won't say it twice." The older man chuckled dryly. "There are 3 of us, Hale." "Enough," said Jonas. "And I have this prairie behind me." The wind blew hard, very hard, as if Wyoming was on his side. Then gunshot, but not from Jonas, but from behind him, from the darkness at the end of the trail. "Someone else is coming." A shot rang out from the end of the trail, stopping everyone. The young man pulled on the reins, and the brown horse reared, whinnying in panic. The older man spun, trying to see where the shot had come from. Jonas held Winchester in his hand but did not pull the trigger. He just watched, his eyes as sharp as a winter storm. In the darkness, at the end of the long dirt road, a figure on horseback appeared. His long brown cloak flapped in the wind. The black horse beneath him was strong, its steps sure. Jonas recognized him at once. "It's Sheriff Warren Briggs of Willow Ridge." The man was an older man from the west, with hair gray at the temples and a face stern but kind behind the cold. Jonas had known him for more than 10 years, a man of few words, but when he spoke one knew it was the truth. Sheriff Briggs rode up, stopping between Jonas and the group of strangers. "The evening was peaceful," he said, his voice tired but not soft, "until I heard a noise from this side of the land." The older man squinted at Briggs. "Who are you, Sheriff?" "Warren Briggs," the man replied. "And you are standing at the gate of Jonas Hale's estate. If you have come here with good intentions, I will listen. Otherwise—" He put his hand on the gun stock. The young man raised his voice in a belligerent tone. "We came to take back what is ours." "That girl," Sheriff interrupted. "No one belongs to anyone in Wyoming. Not even her." The older man frowned. "You don't understand." Sheriff turned his head to look at Jonas. "Jonas, does that girl want to leave this place?" Jonas looked him straight in the eye. "No, she chose to be here." Sheriff Briggs nodded as if confirming the truth, then turned back to the other 3. "That's enough. You have no authority to compel anyone. Not in town, not on this farm, not anywhere under the law." The older man laughed, a dry, gravelly laugh. "Laws? Here in Wyoming we both know my laws are bigger than yours." Briggs was unmoved. "You are mistaken. In this land, the law of the land is important. The law of man is even more important. And Jonas does not stand alone." The older man frowned. "You want to fight because of her." "I didn't fight for her," replied the sheriff. "I stood for what was right." The atmosphere was so tense that even the wind stopped. The older man tightened his grip on the reins, his eyes angry. "You are obstructing something important. I warn you for the last time, give her to me." Jonas raised his Winchester, not slowing this time. "She's not going anywhere." The young man raised his gun, but before he could cock it, Sheriff Briggs threatened to pull the trigger again. "Try it," Briggs said sharply. For a moment the whole space seemed to stand still. Then the older man snorted and lowered his gun. "They offered me more to get her back. I won't give up that easily." Then he turned his horse and led them away. Jonas stood still until the sound of hooves faded into the darkness of the hillside. When Sheriff Briggs turned to Jonas, he sighed. "I guess I came just in time." Jonas nodded. "I am grateful to you." "No need," Briggs replied. "Miriam Clark came to see me after work a few days ago. She told me everything, and I believe her." Jonas turned to the cabin. "Is she okay? Anyone would tremble if hunted like that," Briggs replied. "But she is stronger than she thinks." Jonas pursed his lips. "I know." Sheriff Briggs looked at the man before him, his eyes still. "If that man comes back with more men, you shouldn't fight them alone." "I know," Jonas said, "but I won't let them touch her." Briggs nodded. "Me too. Willow Ridge has no tolerance for men who prey on women for profit." The sheriff turned his horse to leave, but Jonas called back, "Briggs, thank you." The old man looked at Jonas for a long time, then replied, "No need to thank me. In this West we stand together because we have no one else." Then he left. When Jonas entered the cabin, Miriam stood in the middle of the room, her eyes red but brighter than before. She ran to hug Jonas without thinking, without ceremony. A trembling, emotional hug of someone who had just come through the darkness. "Jonas, I thought you—" "I'm here," Jonas said, putting his hand on her back. "And I'll be here." Miriam cried for the first time in years, not from fear, but from safety. Jonas let her lean against his chest, saying nothing. In the West, silence sometimes spoke louder than words. As she pulled away from his embrace, she looked up, her blue eyes, wet and bright. "Jonas, I want to start over. No more running, no more hiding. I want to live a new life, here, with you." Jonas touched her cheek lightly where the bruise had been. "You don't need my permission to start over. You just stay." A tear fell onto his finger. She nodded. "I will stay." Outside, the wind died down. The darkness no longer threatened, it was just the ordinary night of the moors. The next few days passed strangely peacefully. Sheriff Briggs filed a report with the county court investigating the older man. Jonas repaired the fence. Miriam planted trees near the porch. The cows returned to their routine. Life seemed to be bringing back the peace they had lost. One morning when Miriam brought coffee out onto the porch, Jonas was mending an old post. She looked at him, then said softly, "Jonas, you know, I thought I would never be able to love anyone again. But—" Jonas turned back. His eyes softened like morning mist. "But maybe I was wrong." Jonas stepped closer, very closer. "You don't have to say anything if you're not sure. I'm patient enough to wait." Miriam looked at him, her blue eyes bright as dawn. "I don't want to wait any longer. I've made my choice." A gentle wind blew across the vast prairie. Jonas placed his hand on her cheek, as gentle as if she were made of glass. "Miriam," he said in a warm and sincere voice, "since you came here, I have not felt lonely anymore." She smiled. "Me too, Jonas. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm not abandoned." And on that peaceful morning, under the gentle Wyoming sunshine, they stood side by side without vows, just the sincerity of two hearts that had been broken. The healing was quiet. It came like a warm breeze on a cold wind, but strong enough to keep them standing. Jonas took Miriam's hand. "From now on, you are not alone." Miriam shook his hand. "And so do you, Jonas Hale." In the open sky, a flock of geese flies in a V formation, a sign of the new season. The season of rebirth. The season of things worth living. Jonas and Miriam's story reminds us that everyone has a pain in their life that they don't want to name. But sometimes healing doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from a hand extended at the right time. A heart warm enough to let another person lean into after years of suffering. At any age, people still have the chance to start over. Whether 40, 60, or beyond, the heart can still be revived with the right kindness. Jonas chooses to stand by Miriam, not out of strength but out of compassion. Miriam learns to believe in the light again because someone dares to stand beside her in the darkness. It's a simple yet profound lesson. When we show kindness to someone in need, we sometimes find salvation ourselves. Thank you for being part of this story. If you see yourself in Jonas or Miriam, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us continue telling stories that touch hearts. You're here, and that counts.